pays for itself because people pay more property taxes, they pay more business license taxes, they pay more cigarette taxes, they pay more gasoline taxes, they pay more taxes of all kinds, and there's plenty of money to support the additional growth that's going to occur. Well, coincidentally, about that same time, the city of Palo Alto was about to consider annexing several thousand acres to the city of Palo Alto. Now, here are a bunch of eggheads, Stanford University included. And they said, well, before we annex this large amount of land, why don't we do some analysis to see what it's going to cost us to develop that land and in what proportion we might best develop that land. Namely, should it be residential, multifamily residential, business, open space, agriculture, which are the key primary elements of a general plan. And to their credit, they hired a firm by the name of Livingston and Blaney out of San Francisco to do a study to answer that question. And when the study came back, what it said was, you would be better off as a city to buy that land and keep it in open space in perpetuity if you're really looking for the bottom line maximizing dollar. I thought, wow, that's an interesting study. It said growth didn't pay for itself by a professional land planning organization for the first time, to my knowledge, in the history of the United States. Now, coincidentally, about that same time, there were other cities throughout the United States, San Diego being one of them, and Pete Wilson, who that name you must all know and recognize, made a career out of explaining to people what Livingston and Blaney had just put down on paper as professionals. Boca Raton, Florida, and other places, Petaluma, California, and other places looked at all of that and said, yeah, maybe we had better address this issue of growth, and who's paying for it? Well, the Chamber of Commerce and the people that they elected, many of whom are pictured on this wall, said, well, of course we're for controlling and managing growth. But what they meant by that was something terribly different than what most of the people who had responded to the survey that I gave them to look at had said. What they really meant by that was, how can we manage it in such a way that we can make the most money from it in the short haul and let the devil take the hindmost? I understand that, no problem. So the beat goes on, and in addition to ignoring the fact that growth costs money and being able to be elected time and time again and be in a majority position, I finally had an interview with an editor of the then Daily Times Advocate, before it became the North County Times, who asked me the question sometime in the 80s, Jerry, how is it that you continue to be elected and yet are always in a minority of 4-1? That's a fair question. I said, well, if you believe Jess Unruh, money is the mother's milk of politics, and it's the moneyed interests that are buying the very people that your paper, continue to endorse in spite of the logic to do something different. He didn't like that answer. Didn't endorse me. But the reality was, they were going to have a problem, and I thought to myself, what's the first problem they're going to have that will prove my point? Anybody remember what it was? When people come into cities, the reason they do so is because they want city services. And the primary service, whether you like to admit it or not, that you have to have if you're going to densify is you have to be able to get rid of effluent, sewerage. Nobody wants to talk about it, but that's the weak link. And if you think about it, a lot of people who are in the county today want to stay in the county today because they know that their septic system will in fact percolate into the ground and allow them to get rid of effluent. And they also know that if they come into the city, there will be a developer who is looking to amalgamate land in order to get additional density that may be as much as 10 times what their density is, because he will have sewer capacity. Well, that happened and continued to happen. And I kept saying to my fellow council members, you know, sooner or later you're going to run out of sewerage capacity. And when you do, you're not going to be able to continue issuing building permits. And when that happens, you're going to have to either expand the plant, or you're going to have to acknowledge that growth costs money and that you should have done a better job of planning. And they said, oh, no problem, because we will come to the community and we will explain to them that we need to expand the sewer treatment plant, and that we'll have to pass a bond issue, and it'll only cost them a few $100s a year perhaps in terms of additional taxes, and everybody will be happy because that's the way we've always done it. Well, it turns out that they did run out of capacity. It turns out that when they did, they wanted to pass a bond issue. I said, well, I've told you, if you do, I'm going to oppose it, and I think most people in this community will. Well, they finally started listening to that argument and decided, oh, maybe there's a better way to get around this. Why should we risk going to the voters to ask them to pass a bond issue, because we know that this crazy Harmon character is going to stand up and shout from the rooftops that you're just doing this to subsidize growth so we can issue more building permits, and furthermore, you're not going to get a better flush. So they said, why don't we just increase the monthly sewer charge on the water bill by a couple of bucks, and we'll use that income stream to pay off whatever additional monies we have to borrow in order to increase the size of the sewer treatment plant, which they did. Well, just as the city of San Diego is about to face a referendum, different than an initiative, a referendum to undo a decision that they've made recently, namely Paseo 1, the city of Escondido faced a referendum to undo a rate increase. And once that happened, the people said, enough is enough. We're not going to have our rates increased to allow development to simply be subsidized by our increased monthly sewer rates. And so they voted it down. Now, cities in the past had the ability to subsidize growth in a very nasty way that most people didn't fully appreciate, again, because it was difficult to connect the dots. But what they used to do was to say, well, why don't we just increase the tax rate? What is that? That's another dot. Well, every city in the state of California had the opportunity to determine what tax rate they wanted to charge against the assessed valuation of all the properties in the city. And whenever they needed additional money in order to balance the budget, or in order to come up with money to subsidize new development, all they had to do was increase the tax rate every year and multiply that by the assessed valuation, which inflation was driving up anyway. And that gave them the flexibility to get money out of your pocket without you even knowing what happened. And they did it continuously throughout the entire state until Prop 13 was proposed. Remember that? That was the tax revolt. That's when enough people had had enough of too much in the way of subsidization, but they didn't even know what was happening. They didn't know that most of the money was going simply to subsidize further development. But they did pass that. And what did that mean? It meant that when property changed hands, now it could only be assessed at 1% of the market value that it was sold or purchased for. And furthermore, it could only be increased, the tax rate could only be 2% increase per year. And so at least it put a lid to some extent on what would happen. And some of you who may have owned property since Prop 13 know that you're paying a whole lot less in taxes now than you would have otherwise. And so that means there's a whole lot less money that cities have collected that would have gone to subsidizing development. And so what did they do? They turned to the state and said, let's create redevelopment agencies. Whole nother subject, but it's just another tool to help develop, to help subsidize development and to get into the pockets of school districts and individuals so that developers can make more money. Well, you'll notice more recently the state has undone that. Now it's starting to get rock and hard place time. So what I'm suggesting to you is the pressures for growth in one of the 6 most popular geographic areas on the planet is not going to go away. In fact, there's really nothing that stops San Diego County as a region with 18 incorporated cities to becoming another Hong Kong. If you think 3.5 million people are a lot, if you think going to 4.5 million people in the next 15 years is a lot, that's nothing. We could go to 10 or 12 million people. And all it takes is enough figuring to get you to help subsidize that. So, in the 90s, the late 80s and the 90s, there was a general plan still on the books for Escondido that would accommodate 300,000 people. And that had been on the books for 2 or 3 decades. And it gave the City Council and the Chamber of Commerce maximum flexibility in terms of making their case for growth is good. Look what we're planning for. The City Planning Commission would look at the general plan whenever a developer came forward and say, well, why certainly we should increase the zoning to allow them to take optimum use of that general plan capacity that's already on the books and has been for decades. What's wrong with that?